Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me with the microphone? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Appreciate you all showing up for our MPPA policy talk event. This is joined with our MPPA Master in Public Policy and Center for Economics program. And without further ado, I would like to hand over the microphone with our moderator, Dr. Jamshid Damooei, with opening remarks as he comes along the entrance. So thank you all for coming. No worries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good evening. I want to join my good colleague Omeira and welcome you to this evening policy talk. We're delighted to have Maureen McGuire with us, the CEO of Farm Bureau, Ventura County. She took the office back in 2022, correct? And she is just not a CEO, but an expert on all the issues that farming, Farm Bureau, farm industry deals with. Maureen got her first degree, a BA from the Idaho State University, and an MA from the New School, my favorite college. And also got Six Sigma black belt. That's not the kind of black belt you think. It's really becoming an expert in advanced problem solving, processing, the kind of things that someone with a high level of managerial skill and ideas and innovation and looking fresh into matters bring to an industry. And we're delighted that Maureen brings that to our farming. I actually invited my students to come here and tell you something. I didn't offer them any special treatment or extra credit because I said that, coming and listening to Maureen is the best credit that you can have for your education. There are actually students of economics of the environment. I have to see how many of them are here. So glad to have you here, Maureen. She's going to talk about a subject matter which is very vital, very central for our life in California. Both perspectives. One is the water management, the other one agriculture. When I was a young student, I remember that once I talked about agriculture as an industry, and my professor corrected me, said that agriculture is an industry, but it's also a way of life. And that has stayed with me till today. So without further ado, I don't want to talk too much. Maureen, please. And wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really excited to talk to all of you today and really happy to be here. This is actually my first opportunity to talk about the policy-making process that we went through over the last couple of years at the Farm Bureau of Ventura County. And it's an audience that I think is going to be more interested in that policy-making process than who I normally talk to, which is farmers who are really interested in what their requirements are to comply with the regulatory framework. So I hope that you guys will ask questions. It's more interesting and entertaining for me if you guys participate, even if the questions are difficult questions or I don't have the answer for you. I'd rather try. So my PowerPoint left. Okay. So anyway, as the introduction said, I'm Maureen. I'm the CEO of the Farm Bureau of Ventura County. And just really quickly, I want to let people know what the Farm Bureau even is. So we're a historic institution, been around for 110 years. And the Farm Bureau is a nonprofit grassroots institution that's brought together really to help farmers get anything done that they need done. So the Farm Bureau in the past gave out loans. The Farm Bureau was in the past the sort of administrative body to bring in agricultural technology specialists to your community. You had to have a Farm Bureau. They've done things like insurance famously. And now what we really work on is advocacy. And so there's an American Farm Bureau that works on federal policies like real lobbyists. Every state has a Farm Bureau, And the members of the state farm bureaus are the county farm bureaus. So it's like a parliamentary type of structure. And so I run the Farm Bureau of Ventura County, which is an independent 501c5 nonprofit. So not a 501c3, a charitable organization, a 501c5, which is like a political or a trade association type of organization. And we work on lots of different very local issues. So we work on water, land use, labor, anything that kind of comes up. And today what we're going to talk about is our work on the Ventura County Agricultural Irrigated Lands Group, which is a big focus of our specific Farm Bureau. And not every Farm Bureau does this. In other parts of the state, there are independent coalitions that were stood up just to do this coalition-based compliance model. And then they subcontract out, outreach to other groups, and sometimes farm bureaus are involved in that way. We're one of 2 farm bureaus that actually serves as the coalition that has an agreement with the Regional Water Board to do this coalition-based structure that I'll talk to you about, and the other one is in San Diego County. So just a really brief overview. This is Ventura County farmland categories, and there are 316,000 acres of agricultural land, and 100,000 acres of that is irrigated. So 200,000 acres is the open space, used for cattle grazing, and then we have like $2 billion of economic activity happening just in the irrigated acres. All of this land together represents 27% of the land in the county, but it's 57% of the land if you don't count the giant forest up at the top of the county. There are about 2,000 farm operations, and the average size of those operations is 122 acres. Yet 3/4 of the operations are 50 or fewer acres. So what that implies is we have lots of little tiny farms and very few really big farms, right? There has to be some really big farms to draw that average from 50 up to 122 acres. Just want to give you a little snapshot of the diversity of farming here in Ventura County. We have big corporate, internationally geographically diversified farms, and we have little tiny farms that might be somebody's second or third side hustle and not their main job, right? So the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program actually comes from a state mandate. So in every single area, there are these regional water quality control boards, and we're in District 4. So these are based on the hydrology of each of those areas, and these areas are also the same for municipalities, for industrial uses. They're the establishment of the regulatory board that oversees and creates their own individual interpretation of what the needs are for their region. So you can imagine that the needs in Region 7 are a lot different than the needs in Region 4, are a lot different than the needs in Region 2. So the idea is to localize that regulatory framework to each individual area. So for the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, it applies to all growers who irrigate commercial crops. So it's not the 300,000 acres, it's the 100,000 acres of which this regulatory framework applies. And it regulates the water that discharges into surface water, as well as leaching into groundwater. So if it's irrigation water that comes off the field after you water your crops, or the rainfall that comes on top of the field, in a rain event, or flooding water that flows over a field that either goes into the watershed, like the rivers and the ocean, or that seeps down into the groundwater. And the idea is to control and prevent contaminants to protect beneficial uses. So we want to make sure that we are maintaining the use of those waters, whether that's for recreation or environment or drinking water. And the idea is to put these stopgaps in place so that the farming activities are not impacting the beneficial uses of those waters. And then the thing that is interesting and that we're here to talk about is that the growers in Ventura County comply using this third-party coalition model. And here, it's the Ventura County Agriculture Irrigated Lands Group, which is established in 2006 and administered by the Farm Bureau of Ventura County. So that's us / me. So oversight is provided by a 15-member steering committee. So this is other water agencies, they're water lawyers, and then growers who are also enrolled in the program. And we charge by a per acre assessment. So if you're growing on 500 acres, you pay a lot more than if you're growing on half an acre. Everybody pools their money in to cover the cost of administering the program. And right now, we have about 90% of the irrigated acreage enrolled in the program and over 1,400 unique landowners and growers. So that's a very successful program in terms of getting people engaged in the process. And there's different roles. So you have the landowners and growers over here on your left-hand side. And then you have our role in the middle, and then the regional water board on your right-hand side. And everybody has a stake in this coalition-based model. There are certain roles and responsibilities that are appropriate for growers, that are appropriate for us to take on, and that are appropriate for the water board. So, for example, I'll just start with VCALG, what we do. We implement a water quality monitoring program, and I'll show you a map later on what that means. But essentially, we're going out, we're actually taking samples in the river, on the edge of fields during dry weather. So we're essentially looking for irrigation runoff at that time, and during wet weather, so when there's a storm event. And we're taking that information, doing trend analysis, and creating these watershed-specific water quality exceedances back to the growers. So we say, hey, grower A, you're in this watershed. In our representative monitoring site, we're seeing exceedances for nitrogen. Here are some things that you can do on your farm to reduce the likelihood that nitrogen is going to leave. So that could be things like vegetative strips, buffers, or it could be reducing the amount of nitrogen that you apply to your crop through, better education and fertigation practices. So that's our recommendations for management practice implementation. And then we're managing the monitoring and farm-related data for the grower. So they can give us all their data, and they don't need to be afraid that that data is going to somehow be used against them later, right? We anonymize it and put everything together so that the research and the trend analysis can be used for the program overall, instead of individual growers maybe being resistant to share their private operational data to something that could become a public record. And then we coordinate education and outreach programs. So we have mandatory education that's required in order to be a part of our program. And so we have irrigation seminars and demonstrations from, healthy soils programs, and all sorts of different ways that we can engage growers on learning skills they can bring back to their farms to benefit water quality. And then there's the growers themselves. Obviously, the growers are the ones that are going to take action to improve water quality. And so they're going to do that by implementing and maintaining their management practices in the field. They are also submitting implementation surveys to us. They're attending their continuing education. They're paying for the program. And then they're submitting their irrigation nutrient management reports that we're going to go over, and then submitting their additional compliance reports that we're going to go over in more detail. And then I think one of the things that often gets overlooked is the role of the regional water board in making sure that this coalition model works. And what's really important is that they are the enforcement part of the program, and we're not put into an enforcement role. So it's very important that we have trust and are seen as partners of the growers and the implementation arm of the program, but that growers don't have a disadvantage from working with us, or they're not led into a higher level of enforcement because they opted into a program like ours. So the water board can help us administer this coalition-based model by enforcing on things like enrollment. It's required to either enroll with the water board individually, which is very expensive, or be part of our program. They can enforce on completion of CEUs. They can enforce on submittals of those BMP surveys and the implementation of those BMPs where it's applicable. So we talk about the program being successful. Everyone has to do their part. We have to, make the pathway or that experience of the enrollee something that is possible for growers to comply with, that makes sense, that there's tools to help them navigate that compliance pathway. And then the growers have to do their part by making real changes, investment in their fields. And the way that we keep people in that program and not punish the good actors is by making sure that the water board is doing their part of saying like, hey, you've got discharge in an area where there's really no reason to, because you haven't implemented these BMPs. And we often overlook that and think, oh, we want to keep the water board away from the process. No, we want them part of it to help build the accountability system. So this is the monitoring program that we do. It's a representative area monitoring program, which means that we've split up the county into different areas based on the hydrology of that area. And then we've selected monitoring sites that are representative of all growers in that area. So this monitoring site, I wonder if I have this monitoring site here represents all of the growers in this area. This monitoring site 11 represents all the growers here and all the growers here. And this can be a little bit confusing. Like, why does this monitoring site represent a grower up here? The idea is to select these monitoring sites in areas where we're collecting the drainage from representative crop types and cultivation methods that can apply to the other areas. So we don't want to sample here in the middle of Oxnard and have commingled drainage from all the people that live there, because we're not going to be able to convince growers with that data that they should take action on their fields. We want to take samples where we can say, hey, this is actual agricultural drainage. It represents conditions that are very similar to your field. And so now you can understand the link between the monitoring data that we're having and your action on your field. So that's the logic. So we have different sites, and if this area has a lot of orchards, we're going to choose a site that is, is commingling drainage from multiple orchards. If you have a lot of strawberries and vegetables, like on the Oxnard Plains, we're going to choose sites that's commingled strawberry and vegetable drainage. And then the idea is to take that monitoring information and create this iterative process. So we start with our sampling, characterizing the water quality conditions. We develop a water quality monitoring plan, which is this roadmap for implementing targeted management practices. So we're saying you're actually exceeding for this one constituent, and these are the management practices that address those constituents. It's not put anything in. You have to put in things that are related to the actual constituent that's coming off and going into the watershed. Then so we make the plan, then we do the education and outreach, we evaluate through those surveys and the trend analysis of our data, and then we update that water quality management plan. And we go around and around, you know, hoping for water quality improvements on those specific constituents of concern. So the program's gone through a lot of iterations. It started in 2005 as a conditional waiver, and a lot of people get confused. Nothing's being waived. There's no requirement that's not happening because the name of this type of procedural thing is a waiver. There's still discharge requirements that are stringent, but this essentially establishes the program. But a conditional waiver has to be renewed every 5 years. So we see this renewal happen in 2010, which starts incorporating total maximum daily loads, which is kind of benchmarks that people are not supposed to be exceeding into different areas, and we're going to go over that in more detail. So you start seeing the requirements increase. Then we get to 2016 for our third one, and we get additional requirements related to groundwater, additional technical studies on source investigation. We get additional deadlines for this extra regulatory requirement related to daily limits. And then nitrogen plans, which is kind of source control. So saying for people in areas where there's specific exceedances for nitrogen, now we start getting into that how to fertilize education process within this 2016 to 2021 process. So then I start in 2022, and we go into kind of endless COVID-related extensions. And we ended up having the bulk of our policy making happen between 2022 and when this new ag order was adopted very recently, September 28th, 2023. So the ag order is not a conditional waiver. This is a evergreen regulatory framework that stays in now until there's some justifiable reason to go in and change it. And so we really focused on a lot of advocacy for a practical regulatory program because there wasn't going to be a chance to open it back up again. And so I think that's why we have something interesting to say to justify a talk like this. And kind of two big things that are happening right now within this ag order is that they incorporated statewide precedential requirements that we're going to go into, and that a bunch of deadlines are coming due where growers are going to be subject to a much higher requirements. So from 2005 to now, there's been a lot of successes of the program. So significant irrigation efficiency upgrades have made it so that in 79% of our dry weather sampling, there's nothing to sample. Because growers are so good at conserving water, there's literally no water in the drainage, which is great because it means there's no water going into the environment carrying any of these constituents of concern. So this is a really huge success story. We also have 70% of the water quality benchmarks being met. And we've spent more than $1.5 million annually on monitoring and reporting requirements. So there's a lot of monitoring going on to help inform growers. And we've established really, really good collaborative work with the Cayugas Creek Watershed TMDL stakeholder group, Ventura River Algae Group, and then this Ventura River Estuary and Revlon Slough Beardsley Wash trash cleanup projects. So we're combining resources with other stakeholders who have requirements or specific missions to clean up the watersheds in these areas. Additionally, we had in our last conditional waiver period 147 hours of continuing education that we offered, built really good partnerships with Resource Conservation District and the National Resource Conservation Service, and then the development of this nitrogen management program where we're building what that regulatory framework is going to look like, but more importantly, what the education is going to be for the growers. How do we get growers to take into consideration the effect on the environment when they're building their nitrogen plans, and understanding the complexity around that. Whoops, was that it? Okay, so kind of what we learned since 2005 is that farming is variable and dynamic, and we need a flexible and accommodating regulatory framework, and that that incentives work. You know, the enforcement record on, since 2005 is there's been one enforcement action, and to have 90% of irrigated acres enrolled in our program when there's essentially no enforcement means that growers actually care about complying with this regulatory framework. They do it voluntarily, essentially, and I think that's because the incentives have been there. People they live in the community, but they also have incentives aligned to conserve water, to reduce their amount of fertilizer that they put on, to maintain the health of their soils, to not lose their topsoil in floods, right? And that, and we want to prioritize and focus enforcement mostly on people who are not participating. And we need to create clear pathways to compliance. So when we tell growers what we expect from them, they are usually making concerted effort to comply. And then I think one of the big takeaways since 2005 is that monitoring is necessary, but it actually doesn't change water quality. The thing that changes water quality is doing stuff in the fields. So that's what we went into this advocacy period for the ag order, is thinking about these lessons. So moving on to the ag order and some of the big changes that have been now put into law but have not been implemented yet since that September 28th meeting. There's two categories that I'm going to go through with you guys. First is these precedential requirements, and the second are these total maximum daily load driven requirements. So on the precedential requirements, we'll talk about nitrogen tracking. So all of these come from the East San Joaquin waste discharge requirements that were adopted by the State Water Resources Control Board in 2018. And they told everybody in all the districts, by the time you make a new regulatory order, you've got to incorporate these elements into them. And the main goal of these nitrogen regulations is to do source control. So to say, we don't want extra nitrogen being applied and then going into our groundwater or into our watersheds. And instead of just sampling our way out into characterizing everything, well, let's just provide as much education and support for growers to not apply it. So it's actually, I think, a really good method of helping growers through increasing their skills to reduce the nitrogen that's pervasive in the environment, versus the other way to handle that would be, I'm going to monitor the groundwater and you all figure out how to make sure that there's not extra nitrogen in here, which was the old system, right? So everybody's got to do it. It's been super heavily litigated, and so it wasn't something that we took a big stance on because all of that was already defined in the Central Valley. And then, so it focuses on nitrogen in surface and groundwater through this comprehensive irrigation and nutrient management program, including groundwater quality trend monitoring, irrigation nutrient management plan development, and then summary reporting that we do. Additionally, there's on-farm drinking well sampling, and then groundwater protective formulas, values, and targets. That's where we take all of that data together and we start looking for, how do we create a relationship between the nitrogen that's being applied and removed on the farm and what we're seeing in the groundwater trends. So here is our groundwater quality trend monitoring results. And the long-term tracking of nitrogen trends in groundwater wells, that's what is represented here. And almost all of them are meeting drinking water standards. And these are agricultural wells. They're not drinking water wells. So that's already like good news to everyone. We do have some, these orange ones, that are not meeting those requirements. So there's work to be done, but overall, this is a success story for our region that that is not true in the Central Valley or the Central Coast. A lot of this has to do with the hydrology of our basin specifically. It's very hard for water to percolate into the groundwater, and so we have this sort of protective layer keeping our groundwater insulated from pollution more than other areas in the state. So growers are going to have to create this irrigation nitrogen management plan document. It'll be kept on the farm, and then they're going to have to start submitting them to us. And they kind of create this based on the crop, the age of the crop, which is important when you're talking about orchards, and then what types of management practices they're doing. So they create kind of their plan beforehand. What do I think I need in terms of nitrogen that's applied? That can include taking soil samples and seeing what nitrogen is already in the soil, testing their irrigation water to see what nitrogen's already in their water, and then what their fertilizer plan is. And then there's a postseason analysis where they say, okay, what did I actually apply? And then what was removed literally in the flesh of the plant, right? So the goal is that you put on and remove the same amount so that there's no extra nitrogen to go out into the environment. And then if you have more than 10 acres, you have to have your nitrogen management plan certified. So you have to do this CDFA approved workshop. It's like 6 hours and an exam. That's something that we put on. Or you can work with a technical service provider, or you can work with a certified crop advisor. So these are people who have advanced training on fertigation. So they're submitted annually, and then we receive those plans and anonymize them and send that over to the regional board. We use that data to start looking at trends and figuring out where the interventions need to be, and we look at outliers. So who has a high amount of applied nitrogen and no removed nitrogen, or who's in, the 6th standard deviation from the mean, where we're like, we need to focus on educating those growers or figuring out what's happening on that specific farm to give them more resources to reduce their, impact on the environment. So that is huge change for growers, and we're going to have to work through what that looks like. This is all theoretical, and now we have to move into implementing that, which is going to be a challenge. Because if you have a vegetable field where you have 6 different crops rotating, the record keeping is going to be really, really difficult. On the other hand, if you have an orchard where the crops don't change, the record keeping is going to be really easy, but you might not get the harvest for years from the fertilizer you put in today. And so there's really complex ways in which that reporting is going to affect different commodities. And one area that we're still not really sure about is people who grow nursery plants, like horticulture plants, where you actually take the soil and the whole plant away with you. So right now, there isn't a method within the framework for growers who grow nursery plants to comply. And so we're going to have to work through, what does that mean? And some of this stuff gets lost in like the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. And that's what we'll be working on. So then we have the TMDL-driven requirements. And if you're interested in ecology, this is the part that you're going to be, I think, more interested in. Essentially, a total maximum daily load is established after there's an impaired water body that's been established. So think of McGrath Lake. McGrath Lake has legacy pesticides that have, impaired that water body along with a lot of other pollutants, and it's pretty complex. There's an old landfill there. You have a bunch of Oxnard draining into this lake, and a long history of that lake kind of not necessarily receiving the sort of protective interventions that it should have. So they say, okay, we want the State Water Board says, we think the beneficial uses of McGrath Lake include things like swimming, immersing your entire body, right? Okay, the standards to make that safe are pretty stringent. So they calculate, in order for McGrath Lake to reach that beneficial use of fully submersing your body to swim in the lake, then we can only allow the people who discharge in that lake a total maximum daily limit of each of these different constituents of concern. So let's talk about legacy pesticides. Legacy pesticides are pervasive. They haven't been used since the 50s, but they were so effective because they like to bind and not wash away with the water, right? So what happens is that pesticide, let's say DDT, which has really bad implications for birds and other animals. It binds to the soil. It's pervasive. It doesn't break down for a long time. But that's pervasive also in your yard, in the open space where nobody's farming or using it. And everybody gets sort of a certain amount of that discharge that they can put into the lake. So these TMDL, these total maximum daily limits, apply to industrial users, factories. They apply to municipalities, so people who are living in the community that drains into that lake, and to agricultural dischargers. So everybody gets a sort of limit, and the goal being if you meet or lower, or if you are at or lower, then eventually you'll be able to swim in McGrath Lake. So that's the theory. So these are our most significant challenges. Specifically with legacy pesticides, these are not necessarily related to agricultural inputs, but because there's humans doing stuff on that land, then the way the law is, those humans are responsible for that. So if you're going to be tilling your soil and then that molecule is now available to, as sediment, go into the runoff into the lake, well, you're responsible for that. Another example is there's a lot of selenium in our groundwater. And it's not like the farmers are trying to put that in there, but they, through their human activity, move the groundwater from the basin up into the irrigation system, and then that selenium runs off into the watershed. So those humans are responsible for that action. Primarily because growers have been so good with water conservation, the majority of our exceedances and the focus of what I think the next iteration of the program is going to be on wet weather periods. And another challenge is the kinds of management practices that you can do to control these wet weather exceedances are really expensive. So they're huge retention basins. That means you're taking land out of production. Or they're like wastewater treatment plants or engineered wetlands that require tons of people to work together and millions and millions of dollars. So we've kind of already picked all the low-hanging fruit, and now we're on to some of these really tough projects. And so our thought is that regional solutions are going to be most effective. So I kind of explained what those total maximum daily loads are, and another way of thinking them is an additional regulatory layer that applies only to areas that are draining into that impaired water body. And there's deadlines. So if you have exceedances after those compliant dates, then you're going to kick into a whole new set of regulatory requirements that we're going to talk about right now. So in this new order, you have two options. Track 1 is individual monitoring. This is the default compliance pathway that says I'm going to take field-specific samples according to my plan at the edge of my field. You do that for several years. And if you have no exceedances for 2 years, then you start resampling every 5 years. The other track that we're most excited about, and this is what we spent a lot of work on the last year advocating for, is track 2, this implementation focused pathway. And so this is where growers would work with a technical service provider like NRCS or RCD, and they actually come up with management practices that they do on their farm, and they get compliance credit for doing those management practices. And our view is that you're incentivizing growers to make investments on behalf of water quality. You're not just doing tons of monitoring and sampling, because sampling doesn't improve water quality. Action on the field improves water quality. So we worked really, really hard on creating this implementation-focused pathway, and this is really unique to Ventura County. It hasn't existed in this format, in this way, and because some of these exceedances or constituents of concern or pollution elements are really, really hard to comply with. We're talking 1 molecule in an Olympic swimming pool. You know, this is a pathway that's going to make it so we can still have like fruits and vegetables. Like this pathway means people may have to stop farming, because if you can't show that you can comply at the edge of your field, then you're just out of luck. But if we focus on getting people to make real investments on behalf of water quality improvements, and we have a more practical program, then we can strike that balance between the beneficial uses in the environment and then also keeping people in business, right? So that's our view. So I'll talk to you about the timelines. The way that this works, we're taking all of that monitoring data. We see there's an exceedance that's after the TMDL deadline, and we notify the regional water board. They say, yes, we agree that this is an exceedance and this triggers these extra regulatory requirements. And then we notify those growers, and within 2 months of those growers have to decide, am I going to do track 1 or track 2? So track 1, they have 6 months to submit their monitoring and reporting plan. The regional board approves that plan, and then they start implementing that within 10 days. So, you know, implementation can be like ordering the test strips or getting bottles. 10 days is super short, so they're a little flexible on that. On track 2, they have to submit a management practice plan. The regional board approves that plan, and then they have a very specific schedule that they can use. So 5 months for vegetative practices, 8 months for structural non-treatment practices like detention basins, and 15 months for structural treatment practices like bioreactors and, you know, engineered wetlands. And there is a provision to ask for more time if you need it, which is a good thing, because if you need permits or you have to work, you know, to put together a regional project with a bunch of partners, then you're going to need more than 15 months. So the way that the deadlines work, and I just wanted to show an example to you guys, is the deadlines are soonest for the outer reaches of the county, and then they and stormwater management and all of that. And then it reinforces this coalition model that we're never choose it. It has to be something that's of similar difficulty to the other alternatives. So one of the things that we were really disappointed in the process of going through this with the water board is that they created a definition of technical service provider that was very limited. So there's a lot, we submitted like 45 different certifications that we thought a technical service provider should be called that are in line with the structural things like retention basins and tailwater recovery systems. And our view is that the recommendations should be based on the professional judgment of those technical service providers, and that the water board staff shouldn't be precluding solutions. I mean, you know, our view is that they aren't really qualified to do that, right? So our unadopted request is that it would, what we wanted to do is make sure that the management practices included structural and non-structural options, but they limited it to only structural management practices, which is a very small subset of the total amount of solutions that are out there. So we were really disappointed in that. Secondly, on enforcement, we were hoping and advocated for prioritization of enforcement, so that, let's say everybody puts in their management plans and water quality is not getting better. What we wanted to do is have protections in place so that the growers who did everything, they enrolled, they paid their fees, they did their education credits, and they put thousands of dollars into their farms for management practices, would be the last people to be enforced on. So if water quality is getting worse, we thought, first you should enforce on the people who aren't even in the program. Second, enforce the people who aren't coming to the classes they're supposed to go to. Third, enforce on the people who haven't put any management practices in at all. And unfortunately, they did not include any provisions on prioritization of enforcement. So that was really disappointing for us. Additionally, these management practice timelines for the growers are really infeasible. I'll go back to them. Oh, did I go too far? Yes. So, for example, 5 months for vegetative practices. It's totally unethical to put a vegetative practice in when it's not the rainy season. Like, you would never use your really precious groundwater to irrigate a vegetative strip. Like, that's wrong. But we know there's absolutely 5 months in Ventura County where we don't get rain. So we're really disappointed that they built a timeline like this that wasn't based on the practicalities of actually farming. It was based on a different understanding of how the world works. And then another thing that we really emphasized and that we were not successful in getting is focusing these technical service provider resources on farms with the largest impact to water quality. So we did an analysis of everybody that is enrolled in our program, and we found that 57% of the individuals who are enrolled only make up 10% of the irrigated acreage. And 43% make up 90% of the irrigated acreage. So what does that mean? It means there's a lot of really tiny growers with like a 1/4 acre. And you know, this isn't necessarily saying they're disadvantaged. They're probably people in Ojai with beautiful properties, you know, with a couple of trees that are getting harvested by, you know, a harvest contractor. Those aren't the people we want our precious technical service providers servicing. We want them at those big farms where, having a concentrated effort with them is going to really move the needle on what water quality is doing. So our suggestion was farm size prioritization that said if you were less than 20 acres, that you did not have to work with a technical service provider. You would work with us on recommendations based on kind of the standard management practices for the constituents that are a problem for your area. So it doesn't relieve anybody of their compliance obligation, but just to change it so they didn't have to have it certified by a technical service provider. So we were really disappointed that that was not adopted. So what did we learn from that, right? We worked for a year and a half to build this program. We were successful in getting track 2 on the table at all, which was a huge accomplishment. And there's still major parts of the program that we're like really bummed out didn't get included. So first, don't wait to engage with board members. My predecessor spent a year meeting monthly with the water board staff, getting nowhere. Then I came on, I was like, I'm not doing this. And I started calling up the board members individually and having meetings with them. And suddenly, not only did they tell the staff, you need to listen to these guys and incorporate this alternative compliance track, it was their idea. And they were engaged and interested in making that compliance pathway part of the ultimate order. And then another thing I learned is you have to focus on the goal of the regulatory framework. It would be so easy to go up there and talk about how hard it is to be a farmer, but guess what? That's not the job of the Water Quality Control Board. The Water Quality Control Board's job is to make sure that the water quality is at a certain standard. So we created all of our advocacy efforts on water quality, because that was the thing that is meaningful within the system. And I think a lot of groups that are in our situation, they get caught up on pleasing the people enrolled in the system, and talking about kind of their perspective and how hard the new requirements are going to be. And we didn't do that. We talked about what we thought was going to be best for water quality very sincerely, and I feel like it worked. But that required us to have so much trust with the people enrolled in our system, because they want their story to be heard, right? They want to talk about the bad lemon prices. They want to talk about how their family farm is on the edge of shutting down, and those are all worthy stories, but they're not things that are going to make the water board change the regulatory framework. So we really had to lean on the relationship that we had built with the people enrolled in our program, because they weren't hearing from us something that made them feel good. So I thought we did a good job there. The next thing I learned is engaging and engaging again and engaging again 10 more times than you possibly thought would be, necessary. So we worked with obviously all the agricultural stakeholders, but we also worked with Heal the Bay, with Santa Barbara Channel Keepers, with Surfrider, with farm worker advocacy groups. I went on the Farm Worker Resource podcast and talked about what this program was, why it was important, and the areas where we could find alignment. And we received, for all of that, no coordinated opposition to our proposal for Track 2, which was amazing. I mean, that I feel really proud of that. Where we missed an opportunity is we didn't do the 4th engage. So there was actually some letter writing campaign out of the Channel Islands community that was really sincerely felt. And we could have helped direct that letter writing campaign to something that we thought benefited water quality, but instead it was like 80 letters talking about keeping farmers accountable or something. It's like, oh man, if we had done that last 4th engage, then probably we could have built a lot of alignment that wouldn't have resulted in some of the losses that we had. Because the perception was, oh, there's not enough accountability in the system. We need to shorten timelines. We need to reduce the amount of solutions and make it harder, right? And then the other thing I learned, which I wish was not the case, is don't present compromise positions unless you have public stakeholder support. So we did so much soft negotiations in the background that when we presented our already pre-negotiated compromise positions to the water board, they often cut down and tightened what we were asking for because of perceptions that environmental NGOs were going to be in opposition to us. But we'd already pre-negotiated all of that. And so I wouldn't do that again. I would make those NGOs publicly write letters of support before presenting. And, you know, it was not the NGO's faults. They did everything that we agreed to. There was no problem there, and I would work with them 1,000 times over. It was the historical perception of how this stuff works. It was our culture and the way that we have this sort of, you know, ideas of what unintended meanings are behind what people are saying. So next time I wouldn't fall into that trap. And then one thing I really learned is don't be too attached to the outcome. Like, I need to learn to be okay with the 80% that we got, but I'm still upset because it's only been like a month, right? But going in, not leaving anything on the table, doing your best, and then whatever the outcome is, clicking over into implementation mode. And that's the process that we're working on now. So I just, you know, I don't normally talk about this stuff, but since you guys are students and engaged in thinking about the way the world should work, I wanted to share some of those insights. And I think that's it. Yeah.
Maureen, thank you so much. We do have a little time, but although our official time is over, please do come up with your question, and please, go ahead. I can bring the mic to you so you have the question.
Or I can repeat
Anybody?
the question.
Or you can-
Anyone have a question? Go ahead.
If there's an individual or company wanting to partner, how would they be able to do that?
So the question was, if there's an individual or company that wants to partner, how would they do that? So obviously it depends on what that is. We don't make any recommendations or endorsements for like specific products or techniques. So the real way to do that is like go through that scientific process with NRCS and RCD and cooperative extension so that your, whatever it is you're recommending is acknowledged by those technical service providers as a management practice to address those things. And then you can plug into all the ways that you can connect with farmers, either by, presenting at different things we have. Like we just had an ag tech fair on October 24th. So presenting at those, having booths at those, coming to networking events, which I know you already go to, and just getting the word out. For example, Tailwater Systems is a company that we work with who has a modular irrigation tailwater treatment solution. It's kind of like a mini bioreactor. And they're like the only ones that do this. And so they came to our Ag Tech Fair, they connected with everyone, and they've gone through the process of sort of vetting that on the technology side. So I can't recommend anybody work with tailwater systems, but if they say, I want tailwater recovery, I can say, here's all of the people that do that. Yeah. Go ahead.
Are the members of the board experts in water? Are they part of the administration?
So you're talking about the state water board or the regional water quality control board? So the regional water quality control board seats are appointed by the governor, and they're very different. The people who make up those boards are very different in different areas. And so our board, we have a variety of people. Some are retired water agency workers that are experts, and then some are like famous environmental lawyers. And then some are people who, you know, are very interested in politics, and they work on the policy making side.
And are they from Ventura County or what area?
So the LA Regional Water Quality Board, which is the one for our region, there's 5 members of the board, and 2 of them live in Ventura County. 2 out of the 5. And one thing to consider, and this is where we have had such a huge education obligation, is 99.9% of what they see has nothing to do with ag. They see permits for factories, municipalities, special districts, and all the laws that govern those kind of discharges are completely different than the laws that govern agriculture, because we're literally part of the fabric of what keeps people alive, right? You can't put up a lemon orchard or, you know, an orange orchard against somebody who wants to make like plastic mold injection iPhone cases, right? Like the role that those play in society are a lot different. And so the rules for agriculture embed a lot more balance in that, and trying to make sure that agriculture can continue, even though, you know, obviously we want to create an industry that has the least amount of impact on the environment while also making food. Yeah. Go ahead. Is there any incentive besides meeting water quality standards for sustainable agriculture? So in the regulations, they did add extended timelines for people who are moving to regenerative practices. So instead of like 15 months, you have like 25 months, that kind of thing. I don't know if that would really move the needle on somebody making a decision to go to those practices. I think that's probably going to be more market-based. Like, can I sell my product for enough to keep me in business? And I think that's kind of something that we're going to figure out in Ventura County, because we have a lot of people who are interested in serving customers who want that kind of food. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. But a lot of the water quality management practices are kind of regenerative-esque, right? Like putting in vegetative practices. Cover cropping is a huge one for reducing sediment movement. And so I think sometimes that's hard in my mind. I'm like, okay, yeah, regenerative is this thing, but there's like all these practices that are good for the environment. The farmer doesn't have to go all the way down that path of being certified regenerative. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
And so you're worried about the stuff moving off the fields. And when I teach my students about agriculture, we talk a lot about no-till, we talk about conservation tillage, along with all these other practices like cover cropping.
Yeah. That's probably my own bias, because I grew strawberries for 10 years and they're so susceptible to soil-borne pathogens that I don't think that's as pervasive as it is in like the Midwest with corn, right? So obviously on about half of the acreage is in orchards, which are very low till, once every 30 years. So you're already going to get that benefit built into that cropping system. On the other side, you're looking at row vegetables and strawberries. And I think that there's a lot more science and demonstration that needs to be done for that to be something that is adopted in sort of general regular agriculture, especially in the midst of like huge fusarium outbreaks and Calotoxicum. That's going to be something that's going to be proved out through the science, not through the water quality standards. Yeah.
I guess another quick question.
Yeah.
But I was really interested, you mentioned the Graft Lake, because we've been interested in that for a long time. We've been in talks with state parks, with private family. Like the woman at the end of my block is a Graft family member. She tried to get us access to take cores out of that lake. Her brother shut us down as an attorney. We're not trying to turn them in, we're trying to work with them. But I found that the family was very defensive, even though they only own about 5% of that lake, or 10%, and the rest of it's owned by state parks.
Yeah, we have McGrath Lake drainage monitoring sites, and we meet regularly with the growers that are in that TMDL. We actually had a meeting today for 2 hours, which is probably why I use that as my example, because it's in my mind. But part of the issue and barrier is, that's been a heavily litigated area. And so yeah. And that's where I think this coalition-based model has so much upside, because if we look at models where everyone can work together, there's a lot more flexibility for creative problem solving, including like letting a bunch of students come out and take course, because people aren't scared about that, what the repercussions might be, right? But if we go into this very individual responsibility type of model, then everyone's going to be on the defense, because they've got to now negotiate where that line is and how and what their liability is to determine what's best for their business, instead of kind of spreading the responsibility, costs, and then therefore benefits among a much larger group. So I think that's my view is you're a victim of sort of the way our society works, and there's an alternative that hopefully will be emerging through this. And as we work through regional projects, hopefully around McGrath Lake, and people get compliance assurance, they won't have that liability anymore. And maybe in 5 years, you'll be able to go there.
Well, State Parks has come on in.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they own 90%.
Okay, well, metaphorically, hypothetically, in some other alternative universe, yeah. I know
Thank
you're
you
over
very-
time.
We are over time, but I'm meaning to ask you this question. A lot of students here are focused on policy issues and things that really they can use in their learning. I mean, you tend to make sense. Going towards regional solutions serve best. However, in policy making, when you have a standard set, but a much larger area, regional solution doesn't really fly, or is really you come from one obstacle to another. Can you tell us what is that you really are optimistic about, you can really reach by going about regional solution?
So the reason why I'm very optimistic is because we have a history of essentially voluntary compliance. So people, all these growers are putting in $1.5 million a year in a zero enforcement environment to maintain this monitoring program. And we've seen huge improvements in dry weather sampling and also in stormwater, which means people are really doing real things on their farm. And so it's not the stick that's making the difference. And these are investments for the public good. So I don't really think it's the carrot either. I think it's a culture of cooperation, and it's this sense of I'm part of something that is bigger than its constituent parts. And so I have hope that we can maintain and grow that perspective through there and regional projects don't have to be gigantic, right? It can be a drainage ditch with 10 different growers draining to that drainage ditch. I would be happy with that as a regional project. But everybody working together, I think, is really the only solution if you also intrinsically value farming. If you only value water quality and you're happy with taking those farms out of production, then I think you could go toward a model that is much more about exceedances and limitations on the edge of fields. But I don't think you're going to get both. I don't think you're going to get that very focused individual responsibility in a program that, is stormwater and tile drains, and I could go even more and more into that. So I think it's really, in my view, the only option. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and thank you all. You see, it was so captivating that everybody has stayed over time. Thank you so much, Maureen. Appreciate that.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.